Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you've got lots of choices in today's busy market, and I'm always appreciative when you choose to spend your time here. And we look to give you great value to make it worthwhile. And today will be no exception. And I'm so glad you're here, and I can't wait for you to hear today's episode. But just before we dive in, I want to share some ways we can work together. If you're looking to up level the negotiation of your best life, I've got everything from online to group to my signature VIP and mastermind so that you can better leverage your innate power. And yes, you have it to get more of what you want and deserve in life. And if that sounds interesting to you, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And now the reason that you are here for today's program, I am really happy to introduce you to Diane Mueller today. And we're going to be talking about how to negotiate enhanced intimacy and relationship health. So get your pads and pens ready because you're going to want to take notes for this one. So welcome, Diane. It's so great to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Cindy. And just to kind of add on to that intro, yes, we're talking today about negotiation around intimacy and all that. And in my professional opinion, I think that applies to everything in life because what we so often see is that when we get our intimate life in more in the picture
Yeah.
and we really balance our hormones, we are more strong in our connections and our relationship, that spills out into
Yeah.
everything. So yes,
Um,
yes, the topic is what you said, but I also think it's so much more.
Yeah, I love that. And that's so perfectly in line with what we're doing here because I believe that all of life is a negotiation. And when you show up more intentionally in your intimate relationships, it ripples over into every area of your life and helps you show up better professionally, personally, and in all the spaces in between. So, for those of you who may not know her, Diane's a naturopathic doctor. She's a best-selling health author. She's an international speaker. She's host of the Libido Lounge podcast, which I just love that name. And Dr. Diane's on a mission to help couples reclaim their vitality and enhance their well being. And as Diane said, that's in their intimate relationship and all the beautiful ripple effects that come with that. So, why don't we start, Diane? Tell us, how did you come to this line of work?
Well, interestingly enough, it started when I was pretty young at the time. And to walk you through a little bit of my history with intimacy in general, I was raised very Catholic, so the idea of talking about sex was extremely taboo.
Okay.
Talking about anything was like, we refer to genitals as down there and those kind of things. And it was just really off the table, right? So it's
Yeah.
amazing how I got into this with that sort of foundation. So when I was in college getting my undergrad, I had an amazing roommate and friend who was very open about talking about her self-pleasure practice. And to me, this was like so taboo. And I just kind of listened and to just listen back and just like, okay, this is what's happening. But then I started developing vulvar pain. And this pain was like significant enough where it was keeping me up at night. And I went to doctors and nobody could figure out what it was. It was just like, we don't know. Like everything's normal. There's no
Yeah.
infections. It was great. But then it was like, well, what the heck is happening that's causing this? And so this roommate of mine handed me a book after hearing me talk about this for many days. And the book was called Sex for One by Betty Dodson.
Oh,
And in Betty's book, one of the things she talks about a lot of things. It's a really cool book, but she talks about the concept of with self pleasure, she was finding in her work that pain was going away, that all sorts of different pain. So I was like, well,
yeah.
this is really interesting.
Yeah.
So one brave and scary evening, I decided to try self pleasure.
Yeah.
And my pain went away. And I was like, holy crap,
Yeah.
what is this? Right. And so next night, pain was back. Try the same thing, pain went away. And
Amazing.
after several days of doing this, then it was just completely gone. So that was really kind of the intro to now what I often say, which is pleasure is not just about desire, it's something we require. Because since then, like so many of the things I've learned since the 2.5 decades from that time is all of the things that happens when we actually engage in intimacy, all the different changes that happen to our body, to our mind, to our spiritual life, to our interrelational life, and so much more. So it's like, yeah, this is really like, this is about sex. This is about intimacy, of course, but it's about so much
Yeah.
more. And I think sometimes we put sex into this little bucket, right? We think this is
Yeah.
just this like tiny little thing. And if we don't attend to it, then it's so easy to be like, well, it's fine. But we actually don't realize all the different things that can get impacted by not prioritizing this.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you started there. I'm so glad I asked the question. I didn't know your background, actually. I love that story. And in particular, 'cause I think for so long, like I'm glad we're hitting right out of the gate about the taboo, because I think that's one of the big problems. And in North America in particular, like we are so far behind in many ways. We have very childish outlooks about it, or as you say, with various religions that impose all of these restrictions. And I think women in particular are hit hardest by that. And I guess before we get into some of the sort of practical stuff, let's start with the mindset piece. I often say that our most important negotiation is, first and foremost, the negotiation we have with ourselves all the time. So I'm curious, what mindset problems do you see in your work that arise that interfere with intimacy in relationships?
Well, to start that, I will also say, to kind of add on the most important thing, that our most important sex organ is our brain.
Yeah,
And our largest sex organ is our brain. So it's a really good question you're asking around what are the mental challenges or blocks that are happening there, because so much of sex, of desire, of passion actually begins not in our genitals, not with our hormones, but actually with our brain. And so there's many different things we could cover here. Are as simple as shame and self-shame, right? Or shame around sex. And this is from the things that, we've already mentioned a little bit. It's from anything from society to religion, culture. It's to things like, well, maybe how did we learn about sex? Or what did our first sexual partner say? Or what, these tiny little like micro
yeah,
traumas that can happen that really leave an imprint to us on or in us around what sex is and around our sex, relationship with it. So those are all really big things. We see what's interesting too, like one of my favorite things to talk about in medicine are vicious cycles. So what's interesting is like what can actually help heal shame around sex the most is really being with a loving partner
yeah,
and actually healing. Like we like, I used to think, for example, like in like relationship issues, if there's been like relationship trauma, like some therapists will say like, well, you got to be whole before you go into another relationship. And I'm much more aligned with other
mhm,
therapeutic teachings, which is like, well, if it's an interrelational thing, we actually heal that in relationships with the
yeah,
right partner,
yeah,
right? And I think the same thing is true around shame when it comes to sex, is that hey, if there are micro traumas around this, the more we can work with the mind in context of being in relationship with a partner that we can share. Like for example, when we are in a deep state of sexual connection, of intimate connection, and especially when we get closer to those heightened stages of arousal,
yeah,
it's almost like being in a hypnotic state where we
yeah,
know our brain is really suggestible. So like one of the things that I love doing in my life is talking to my partner about the things that are coming up for me around like, wow, that's a new belief that I didn't realize I had, that I'm holding,
yeah,
that I want to repattern. And I'll talk to him before we make love and I'll be like, hey, when we get to this point of intensity, can you say this to me? Can you say that to me?
yeah,
And I use those heightened states sometimes, not only for pleasure and passion and all those things, but actually for healing some
yeah.
of the shame and the guilt that I have from, core beliefs and micro traumas of my past.
Yeah.
So those are a couple things. I could go on and on, but I want to pause for a second for
Well, and
you.
I want to do a check-in for our listeners. I challenge you right now, sort of at the outset, as we're kickstarting this right out of the gate here. Do a quick check-in yourself. What kind of reaction are you having to having this discussion here? Are you feeling discomfort? And if so, maybe it's something you want to start exploring as well. And open up yourself to just experiencing this conversation. And also question, I invite all of you to go back and think of it, because you said something that really resonated with me, Diane, about those micro traumas about a first partner you ever had. And I think we grow up with all of this conditioning about it being taboo. And if you have an experience where somebody makes you feel inadequate, makes you feel insecure, makes you feel like this is naughty, inappropriate, makes you feel like a skank if you're a woman or whatever, labeling happened and what you carry with you. And I wanted to circle back because as you were just talking about those relationships, I think one of the things that really can hinder it, ego, right, shows up, frankly, not just in our sexual, our intimate relationships, but ego shows up and sabotages most negotiations, and it can be really problematic in romantic relationships. So you were just starting on that. I'd love if you could dig a little bit about what tips do you have for how to communicate about sex without hurting your partner's ego. I think that's something that's always a worry.
Yeah, it's really important. And to go into that, I want to first just help people understand one component of it, high level, and then we can go on to go into more
You
like the
bet.
strategies like you're talking about. So anytime we look at like research, for example, on conflict, right? We see that there's three threats in any conflict. There's a threat to the one party, the
Yeah.
threat to the other party, and the threat to the co-space, right?
Yeah.
And in most conflicts, what we see in studies is that those three threats like are pretty equal. But what's really interesting in this conversation around ego is that when it comes to sex and talking about what we want, what we desire, our fantasies out of these three threats,
Yeah.
one of them is significantly stronger when it comes to sexual intimacy.
Mm.
And that is the threat to the self. So, like, if I'm bringing up something to my partner, for example, around, like, hey, I have this new fantasy, I want to try this, I'm going to immediately orient to protecting myself. He's going to immediately
Yeah.
orient to protecting his self subconsciously.
Yeah.
So I think just knowing that is kind of like the first step around like there is a natural tendency, and it's probably evolutionary.
Yeah.
There's a natural tendency to want to protect the ego. So that means that when we go into these conversations, we have to have an extra level of care to
Yeah.
understand that that's happening. So from there, I talk a lot about the how, the when, and the where of these kind of conversations. So we'll start with the where and the when because they're the easiest, and then we'll go into the how.
Yeah.
So the where is super simple. It's just have these conversations not in places where you are intimate, right? So it's like
Yeah.
in the bedroom after making love, most of the time is not the best time to have these conversations because again, it's like we're trying to avoid these micro traumas and these triggers. So if something doesn't go well with this conversation, the last thing we want is now that memory of like, oh wow, that was really bad
Yeah.
associated with the place where we make love, right? That's just a really bad trigger. So then we start making love again and we have images of that conversation and the failure of that conversation. And that can lead to, bidirectional performance anxiety and so many other issues. I do find that when people are more skilled, that they are then oftentimes able to break more of these rules and there's that foundation and that trust and that sort of thing, but initially until we start working this muscle like anything,
Yeah.
that's a really important where. Do you want me to go into the other two or did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I think we should. And it's funny, you're so in line. And the reason, if you're wondering why I'm smiling, it's because, one of the foundational pieces of my, I call it the art of feminine negotiation. I call it the 5W model. And where and when are two of the most important W's. And I rarely hear other experts talking about it. And I believe, and one of the things I often say is some conversations you want to have in the bedroom and some you never want to have take up that space, right? So it's so interesting that you're saying that. So by all means, carry on.
I love the alignment. I love the alignment. So I'm like super curious to see what you're going to say about what I've seen with the when and see if we're
Yeah.
aligned here. So what I have found with the when is actually having a conversation ahead of time and kind of pre-framing that this is coming. So this is not the honey, I need to talk, right? Like that
Yeah.
never makes anybody feel safe and like, that type of thing. So the idea is we want to pre-frame it as something like, wow, I listened to this podcast and it really made me excited to like talk more about our sex life. Like,
Yeah.
would you be open to that? Would this be a good time? So it kind of like they pre-frame knowing they're going into this conversation and what it is, and if they have had a fight with their boss or
Yeah.
something crazy has happened and like, honey, I really don't want to have this conversation, but it's not looming in their consciousness like, oh my God, honey, I gotta talk, like I'm in trouble. Like we want to keep that out of it.
Yeah.
So I really think like the asking for permission, like, is this a good time or when is a good time? But the thing that I hesitate, that I always caution people here is like, because it is a new muscle we're working and it can be tricky, we have to be a little cautious about the when, because what can happen is it could never be a good time where I'm like, oh, I don't want to talk about that now. I don't want to talk about that now.
Yeah.
So if it's uncomfortable, we do also have to have the awareness of like, sometime if we want to talk about this, we do have to rip off the band-aid and just say, go for it. So if you're finding that, okay, it's never a good time, then oftentimes there's a follow-up conversation to say, actually, honey, this is really important to me. Like, I know it's really hard to find a time, but can we actually schedule something and commit to it? Because this is just feels so important to me and so important to, my relationship with you. And I just really want to explore this kind of thing. So that's how I approach the win. I'm curious though, how does that align with your model?
Oh, that totally aligns. I love that. And I think if people just, listen to these kind of conversations and educate themselves, I think conversations would go so differently, right? It would just showing up with a little more intention about it. And I would add just, and I'm interested on your thoughts on this because one of the third W's is who. And as you were saying that again, I'm kind of chuckling to myself thinking about think about who you want to be when you show up for that conversation. We all carry different roles in life, right? Mother, mother, girlfriend, intimate partner, wife, lawyer, whatever the heck it is. But also who are they likely to be and who do they expect you to show up as? And I'll just share really quickly, and I'm sure you'll get a kick out of this. Very early in my relationship, I've been married, pushing 30 years in a couple of months here. And one of the first times, and you talk about that pre-framing, we make assumptions. And I made an assumption that obviously, if I dress up in a particular way, it's going to be totally welcome and a great surprise. And I got, dolled up and not much and the high boots and showed up. And my husband's he's going to be mortified I'm sharing this. Total small town country boy, grew up in a community of 700 people. I was always a city girl. And so I walked in, dressed up, and his face, Diane, I got to tell you, he looked so utterly shocked because it was not the who he expected. And I confess, back this is 30 years ago, before I had my epiphany about, the art of feminine negotiation. And you talk about ego, it so struck my ego. I turned around, walked away, took him on, never even gave a chance to have the conversation. So I love your where and when, and I would add a who to that as well.
Well, I love it, and it's so important, right? So before I get into the how, I'll comment on that because I've seen similar types of scenarios. This is one of many reasons why I encourage couples to start scheduling some of their intimacy dates, especially if they're trying out new things.
Yeah.
Because I've seen similar types of situations where it's like, okay, well, that was a different who, and it can even be like, even if that is not a shock to somebody, like I've seen
Yeah.
situations where even if okay, a partner's, let's say in this example, a partner's like, okay, well, I've seen this before, it's not a shock, but they might not be in the space to receive
Yeah.
it, right? They
Yeah.
might have had the worst day ever, and like
Yeah.
all of us, so it's still like, even though it's not
Yeah.
largely a shock, it might be an acute shock in that moment to be like,
Yeah.
wow, I'm just trying to survive the day, and like I don't
Yeah.
even know how to like take this in, even if it's like the most beautiful sight in the whole
Yeah.
world. Right. So I love that, who I think is a really, really important component of it too.
Yeah. Okay. So let's hear your how.
Wow. Okay, so how is all about how we frame it. So one of the biggest things with that I've seen is when we have these conversations, the first thing to really focus on is more about what we want more of over what we want less of. So obviously, if there's something that's happening that's like, wow, this is really bad for my psyche that this is happening, or this is painful, of course we want to say those things sooner than
Sure.
later. But a lot of times it can be, these types of scenarios where like we've been sexually doing the same thing sometimes for decades, and we get
Yeah.
into our scripts, and maybe it was even working one day and we just keep doing it over and over. And it's like, well, that stopped working a decade ago, but I didn't say anything, right?
Yeah.
And so, in these kind of conversations, the first thing to really think about is what are the details of intimacy with your partner that you love? And sometimes this even takes like having an intimate experience or closing your eyes and going into a memory. And the more specific you can be, the better.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, if it's the way they touch your thigh, right?
Yeah.
If it's the special way they caress your breasts at that particular moment, whatever it may be. And so, in the how, we're saying, wow, babe, I just absolutely love this. And I'm noticing that maybe you only do that for like a short little moment, and I find myself just wanting more.
Yeah.
And so again, here we're like really taking care of the other person's ego, because if
Yeah.
we're starting with like, we are this thing, is awesome. You're doing more, do more of it. And that might be enough oftentimes for that first conversation, right?
Yeah.
Like, again, I find like when we're skilled, we can have these conversations for, like dissect it for hours if we want to. But in the beginning, while we're building that muscle and we're really helping protect that ego, sometimes it's just like, hey, let's just focus on doing, and then they're going to be like, wow, I like this conversation. Like,
Yeah.
look at the things I'm doing right.
Yeah.
And sometimes by focusing more on the good things we like, some of the things that we're like, that's not doing it as much, some of those will just start to fall away because
Yeah.
there's only so much space and time.
Yeah.
Now, once that is developed and that is practiced, then of course, like I strongly recommend people, if there's something that is happening intimately, like we do want to get to a point of letting our partner know, right? That's not serving anybody and it's like not good for arousal. It's not good for coming back into like the desire of wanting to be back in that intimate space. If all of a sudden you have a state shift because this thing they're doing is like
Yeah.
not great at all, right?
Yeah.
So when we're saying those things, again, starting with that is almost like, in some ways like the sandwich methodology, but I don't necessarily see that we always have to finish with the good stuff on the other
Yeah.
end. Although I do think it is still good to say something positive, like in the sandwich methodology on the other
Yeah.
end. But I think the biggest things, the most important things is starting with the positive of, hey, I love this thing, be specific. And then the way we frame the second part, the thing that we want to change is super important because the last thing we want to do is like, I hate the way you touch me there. Like, like, right? Like that can just burn. And so it's
Yeah.
softer than that. There's a softness to it. And also acknowledging, right, within we do this, that the body often changes with time. And so, for example, like a way we could say, hey, I don't like that thing anymore, is like, hey, this thing, the way that you've been grabbing my thigh, like, gosh, I like remember this point where I just like used to love it. And it's like
Yeah.
so crazy watching my body change, where this thing is just like, it's like having a very different impact on me now, and it's I'm like so curious about it because you really used to love it, and now it's just like not really, like it's just kind of leaving me flat.
Yeah.
So again, if you can like piece out what I'm doing there,
Yeah.
I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong. I'm making it,
Yeah.
I'm not, and I'm acknowledging even that this thing is not a bad thing. It
Yeah.
doesn't they're not a good lover. It's just like, wow, I'm just curious about the feelings inside my body, and I'm inviting them to be curious with me.
Oh, I'm so in alignment on this. And I want to really put a pin in this for our listeners because not only is this so important in your intimate relationships, but as Diane's sharing this, I want you to really be thinking where this can flow over into other areas of your life because that is such an important skill that we seem to be moving away from with our sort of polarized views in society right now. And it's such a simple thing, whether it's in a critique group in writing, you start with the positive, right? This, I love this about it. This really resonated. Maybe you could do more of that because that was really effective before you start then say having the space. It's received very differently. The same even in a conversation where somebody's making inappropriate bullying comments or maybe racist comments. If you call them out as a racist, if you start with the negative, you're going to get some backlash, as opposed to if you start by saying, I'm sure that treating people with dignity and respect is really important to you. And I'm not sure what's happening here, but we seem to be having a dynamic that's problematic. Very different framing. So I love, Diane, that you've brought that kind of framing. It's so skillfully to be shared with us about how you get more intentional about bringing that into your intimate relationships as well. So we're talking about communication now, and one of the things, and you've talked about sort of decades relationships, and obviously I'm in one. What role would you say that effective communication plays in keeping passion alive for couples?
I think it's one of those core fundamental things that exists is the communication. And the reason why, in part, like if we look back into the new relationship energy, right? That like buzzy feeling that, that we all probably remember and love. There's like so much
Yeah.
excitement in that feeling. And what's actually happening with that scenario in that new relationship energy, and that buzz has a lot to do with the neurotransmitter, the brain chemical dopamine. And what happens in that new relationship energy, and this is going to tie back to your question, I promise.
Yeah,
um,
no, this is great.
what happens in that new relationship energy with that dopamine is space. So essentially in the beginning when we are dating, we meet somebody and we're like, oh, are they going to call? Well,
Yeah.
that space between are they going to call or are they going to not will secrete a little bit amount of dopamine, that unknown, or and they're going to call. And then they call and we get a huge spike of it. And our brain is like, yes, I want more. And then they invite us on a date and that cycle starts over. And then is it going to be a second date? And are we going to have our first kiss? And every time there's something new, we get this anticipatory, like low level of dopamine and then this reward dopamine, right? When we actually get the thing. It's both motivation
Yeah.
to drive us to the thing and the reward. And then we as the relationship progress, we tend to combine our worlds, right? So oftentimes we move in together, or maybe we get married, we start to share, at least at the very minimum, there's so much more shared space and time.
Yeah.
And then there's no level of that space. So there's no level of that dopamine. Everything becomes safe.
Yeah.
Safety is like anti-dopamine, right? And I'm a huge like believer in what I've seen is like there can be with safety in terms of sex and intimacy. Safety can create space where people are able to surrender, to go so much deeper. But the problem is if we don't have the conversation piece and we don't understand this core piece of what drives us to novelty and to passion and all that, we're
Yeah.
missing some of it. So one of the biggest ways to create more of that passion in relationships is truly through novelty. And it's not just by trying new things, it's by creating some level of that new relationship energy. So, for example, maybe we are going to try bringing a new sex toy into our intimate space. Maybe we're going to try a new position, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we're going to even role play, right? So
Yeah.
whatever the novelty thing is, once you decide upon it, and you guys can go to mysexdoc.com to get my yes, no, maybe checklist that will give you about 150 ideas on novelty. So that's really fun. So
That's
that's at
awesome.
mysexdoc.com. But when you have, so now you have, let's say it's going to be role playing, right? So a couple is going to try to do some role playing for the first time. Then the way to create this sort of scenario of bringing that dopamine, bringing that novelty, which is connected to that passion is, well, we're going to plan it. And what are we going to role play now? What it brings us back to that new relationship energy. And this is what we do. We start to say, well, I'm going to flirt about this. I'm going to send a text and maybe I'm going to be in this persona. And maybe I'm going to talk to my partner about like, well, I'm going to wear this or I'm going to do this to you. What are you going to do to me? So we start, and that
Yeah.
changes that psychology in the brain. It changes that dopamine and it puts us back on that reward. Well, then back to your original question, we can't do any of this well if we don't figure out the basics of communication
Yeah.
and how we're going to talk about it and how this is going to look and how we're going to bring this in and is this even interesting to you? It's like on my yes no maybe checklist, one of the things that I talk about when I coach people there is like, well, when we're talking about these things we want to try, what happens if I bring up something that I'm fantasizing about and my partner's shocked by it and offers me shame in
Yeah.
exchange, right? So we have to have those foundations down so we can bring this stuff up and we have that way of communicating where, oh, even if my partner is not into that and they are allowed to have their own opinion, that we're not going to proceed in this conversation where anybody is going to get shamed and then shut down and have the opposite type of reaction.
Yeah. I love that. And on both sides, frankly, right? Because otherwise it's so easy for those conversations to shut down. And then the couple shut down, the intimacy shuts down. So both of them know it's a safe space that, if they give you something and you feel shit, you continue to have the communication about it and sort it out, be able to come to some resolution. I love that. Now, you
Exactly.
had talked about our changing bodies and that. And I'm wondering if you want to spend a minute to address like some of the underlying root causes for low libido, for example.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, 100%. So this is super important, right? And this is super important at any age. And what's also important about, the changing body conversation is as you're listening to this and listening to these root causes, just kind of keep in mind around like, oh, you might like feel like right now, like as you listen to this, like, oh, maybe it's only like over here from a root cause perspective that could be impacting a libido. And a decade later, it might, change, right? Because these bodies, these minds, these spirits, they do change. So I have found in my work that I can break down the root causes of low libido into three different pillars. And then in each pillar category, we could call them, there's subcategories. So the big picture, the three major pillars are our physical root causes. So these are all kind of like the medical body
Sure.
reasons, right? Second pillar is personal root causes. These are all the internal personal things. So where's my, do I have performance anxiety? Where's my sexual confidence? Do I have genital shame? Do I
Yeah.
have other shame? How well do I know my body? Am I able to even give myself an orgasm? Like all of those types of things
Yeah.
under the personal. And then the interpersonal is more around the relationship. Am I able to, to try new things with my partner? What is my communication like? What happens if we have an awkward moment during sex?
Yeah.
I don't know anybody who hasn't had an awkward moment during sex.
Yeah.
So, like, how do we deal with that? Like, what is the relationship like in that regard? So, you want me to go into all of these a little more?
Yeah, sure. Well, one question that jumped up when you're talking about the personal ones, I assume that would include if somebody's had some kind of sexual trauma as well. Would that be the personal baggage that they bring?
I often put any of like the traumas more from like because that's in some ways like we could separate it into two areas, right? So there can be a physical response to any sort of trauma, right? So for many people that is things like pelvic floor tension, pelvic pain, right? We start to hold those muscles,
Yeah.
neurological imbalances. So there can be a result of trauma that falls into creating physical imbalances. And
Okay.
then there's also that personal,
Yeah.
mental, emotional side where it's like, well, now, I was harmed, maybe I was shamed, and all of the emotions that go with it. So trauma really can be teased out
Yeah.
oftentimes to those couple categories. And of course,
And
there can be, of course, that interrelational impact as well. So there's certainly some things that we could, put like that into
yeah.
all categories. Yeah.
That makes sense. And when we're talking about libido, I know you speak about unique libido codes. In fact, I think you have a very unique system around that. So what are unique libido codes? How do they come into play in negotiating sort of enhanced intimacy?
You're setting me up so well to give your audience so many free things. So So I'll tell you just so everybody knows, if you go to libidoquiz.com, you can find a quiz that will guide you through a free quiz that will help you identify some of the physical root causes, and it'll give you like, oh, make sure you talk to your doctor about this lab test. So I just want to throw that out there as a tool for
Awesome.
your audience.
Love it.
Libido codes are really important because this is what I have observed over the years as far as unique kind of archetypes, unique kind of ways we are programmed around our biggest turn on tendencies. And it's kind of like a different version in many ways, like love languages for anybody
Yeah.
that knows Gary Chapman's work.
Yeah.
So like, the love language is like, oh, like in his work, he really identified, hey, if you have this particular love language and your partner has a different way of expressing and showing love, that you might miss the signals and
Yeah.
you might be like, wow, they're not even like, showing me this, and they actually are. So
Yeah.
the same thing with the libido code, which is all about your turn-ons and your sex drive. So another thing you guys can do is go to libidocode.com. So we have libidoquiz.com, libidocode.com. And at libidocode.com, what you're going to basically identify this. And so what you'll find, for example, like one of the types is a what's called a sensate. And the sensate is so turned on by everything in their environments. Like this is the person that is going to most all the time really take the time to get the essential oils going in the room and get the candles and the music and the lighting and like we all do tend to have varying degrees of all five of these types.
Yeah.
But what tends just like, love language books, there tends to be that predominant. And where this can go wrong, for example, if there's somebody that's strongly a sensate, partnered with somebody that is not really much of a sensate or only a small amount of it, and let's say they start
Yeah.
making out and they're having this super hot, passionate makeout session and the energy is growing and everybody's just like feeling great. And all of a sudden the sensate interrupts it real fast and they go off to like light the candle. And the other person's like, what the heck? Like, and it can feel super disruptive until
Yeah.
you realize that that person is doing it
Yeah.
because they actually it like that helps them go deeper into the moment with you. So when we understand like our turn-ons, one, we can start doing things ahead of time to help our partner get in the mood.
Yeah.
But two, when these like micro things happen, we are actually able to say like, oh, that is not them abandoning me. That is not XYZ. That is actually them taking care of the moment because they are so invested in this
Yeah.
that they would like to take the 30 seconds so they can go into this even deeper.
Yeah. I love it. And for our listeners, I strongly, strongly encourage you to take advantage of this offer that Diane's given. Go grab your little quiz on that, find out what your libido code is. I did a version of this with my husband and I, and it was a game changer, Diane, right? And the other thing that's beautiful about it is when you see what category you fit into, what your code is, it also opens the door for the conversation, the kind of communication that Diane was talking about earlier as well. And it's a safe way to be, you each go and do your little quiz, sort of separately, and then you come together and just have a fun evening being able to talk about it. And I know from our experience, it was a huge eye opener to be able to see, well, that explains a lot of where these blocks are becoming, because I'm this and you're this, and then we're able to find out how we can make it work for each other. So I love that. I can't wait. And thank you for the free resources. Our listeners love getting free resources. So
Yeah,
that's
who
obviously
doesn't?
fabulous. And I can't believe how quick our time has gone. I definitely would love to have you back. I feel like we've just scratched the tip of the iceberg here. But I normally like to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? Doesn't have to be about this topic at all, just one of those aha moments.
Great question. I work on my mind so much, so I feel like I could go so many different ways. I do think this core thing that I've said around pleasure is not just about
Yeah,
desire, it's something we require is a really big one.
yeah,
But I think even beyond that, I would say it's big picture understanding how much my thoughts create my reality and how much my feelings create my reality. And it's really, gosh, it's really hard in this moment for me to identify just like one particular thing. I'd say another thing I would say though, as I'm like scratching through like all the layers of my mind,
yeah.
is the body just has such a deep desire to experience pleasure. And I like we can go back to say, okay, back to, my religious roots where I thought this was really, really bad.
Yeah.
And pleasure and like the hormones with pleasure, they help us build bones. They
Yeah.
actually can help us lose weight. Like there
Wow.
are so many different things. And so I think that probably from like within the context of this topic, for so long, this was like even in studying this stuff, there was still something that was just like that extra thing on the side that like, yeah, I knew it was important, knew to try to fit in. But the deeper I've gone with this, it's like I am very, very aware, with my partner around like we are making sure that this is part of our lives several
Yeah.
times a week, our pleasure practice.
Yeah.
And I think probably from a mindset standpoint, just like really getting to the point where it's like work is going to be work and, it's always going to be there. It's like I have a very busy career, but if
Yeah.
I don't take care of my relationship, it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
And fundamentally doing that has probably been one of the most key things that I've done to, have such a successful relationship.
Yeah. And I love how all of those things that you talked about, they really tie together as well, right? Because when we push past that conditioning and recognize the value of pleasure, not as a decadent sort of indulgence, for one of a better, but you're right, that pleasure center helps us when we recognize the importance of it scientifically, even. It helps us focus better. It makes us more productive. It makes us show up as better versions of ourselves, which then gives us better relationships, not just with our intimate partners or with our kids, but in business and across the board. When we deprive ourselves of that, the opposite is also true. We show up with a little more resentment, a little more bitterness. We're putting out a little bit more negative energy. We're less focused, actually. We get a little foggy and end up getting less mutually beneficial outcomes, not just in our intimate relationships, but so far beyond that. So Diane, I can't thank you enough. And I also have to give you credit because and for our listeners, I hope you really appreciate it as well. Diane has dropped so much content for you. Sometimes you get people who are like just so worried about selling what they do that they're always just giving a little tease and holding back. But Diane has really given us lots of actionable information here to kickstart. And she does also offer services. So if you want to look into this further, where should people go, Diane, to learn more about you?
Super easy. Just mylibidodoc.com. I have a libido club. I also call it the Hot and Modern Monogamy Club, where take these concepts that we're talking about, plus tips, techniques, so much more. I bring in expert guests. I think I've had close to 30 expert guests now I've interviewed to be in the platform. So it's just a great way of coming in, of getting support for your relationship, your love life, any performance issues, and so much more. I'd love to
Oh,
have.
that's so fantastic. And again, for our listeners, I really encourage you, take advantage as well. We'll make sure to put in the show notes some of those free gifts that Diane has talked about. We'll make sure to put that website in there as well. And when somebody is generous enough to offer that up, take the few moments to go and check it out and make sure you take advantage of those resources while, and I recommend that you do it now while it's fresh on your mind. Or if you happen to be driving, as soon as you get home, make sure to check that out. So again, thank you so much, Diane. Really appreciate you being here and this conversation. It's been a load of fun.
Thank you, Cindy. Bye, everybody. It's been great.
And for our listeners, I have no doubt, like I say, just so much value here today. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that yet and give the gift of sharing, especially if you have friends that you think would be uncomfortable by this conversation. I encourage you to share it with them specifically. Share it broadly, but in particular, people who maybe could take a little advantage of listening to this particular episode and being able to get some benefit from it in the privacy of their own space. And they can check out some of Diane's resources to help them step up their game. And make sure to grab a copy of my book, Art of Feminine Negotiation, if you haven't done that already. Certainly in alignment with a lot of stuff that you've heard from Diane here. And that is a wrap for this episode. Until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.